of the talks by two dear friends this afternoon, which is a real privilege. And it's a great honor to introduce Professor Erika Luciano from the University of Torino, who is going to speak about the mythopoesis of mathematics in fascist Italy. Thanks a lot, Erika.
So thank you to everybody. First of all, thank you to the organizers, Adrian, June, Chris, and Roy for the invitation. It was a great honor to be here. I loved work with all of us. I learned a lot, and of course, thank you so much for the invitation to give this talk in the opening workshop. And then, let me honestly confess that when I received the invitation to give a talk answering the question, what do you consider to be the most significant open question or lacuna in your area of the history of mathematics, I was really worried. Adrian's further clarification was thus more than welcomed. He wrote in a mail which is and will be kept in my personal archive, so in 20 years or so less, I will have, like Niccolo, an email to show. Although the question may initially seem somewhat intimidating, he wrote, it is not intended to be so. In fact, it is simply asking what you consider to be the most significant, that is, interesting, exciting, appealing, fascinating question, topic, concept, period, or problem in your area, in which a serious research remains to be done. And that was what convinced me to focus this presentation on the mathematical mythopoesis, literally mathematical myth-making, in fascist Italy. A very fascinating chapter in the history of mathematics during the fascist rule, about which comparatively little down is known, and in which serious research remains to be done. Today's contributions, in particular, will be part of a larger research project on mathematical mythopoesis in fascist Italy. So every suggestion is more than welcomed. A research project in a course that I will have just begun to develop, and which aims at investigating a series of initiatives of monumentalization, celebration, propaganda and promotion of Italian mathematics at home and abroad, moving at the crossroads of various methodological perspectives. Social history, of course, which is my field of expertise, my comfort zone, but also history of international relations, cultural history, history of science diplomacy, and history of museology. Well, every mythopoesis has its rhapsodes and its courts, where myths are sung and handed down. In our case, the rhapsodes were two pure mathematicians, Francesco Severi and Enrico Bompiani, and an applied mathematician, Mauro Piccone. And the courts were also essentially three: the Italian Mathematical Union, Unione Matematica Italiana, the Accademia d'Italia, Academy of Italy, and the Società Italiana per il Progresso delle Scienze, the Italian Society for the Advancement of Science. The Italian fascist regime, which was established in 1922, immediately paid intense attention to the science media, to all that falls under the umbrella of communication, popularization, and spectacularization of science. However, the mythopoetic events with the greatest impact in mathematics can all be placed temporally in the so-called imperial phase of fascism, that is between the late 30s and 1943, the date of the fall of the regime. Their list includes the International Congress of Mathematicians in Bologna in September 1928, the exhibition of Italian mathematical achievements organized by Bompiani as part of the Chicago World's Fair, Severi Mathematical's journey to Japan in 1936, the celebrations of Archimedes, Leonardo, and Galileo, the mathematics section of the Universal Exhibition in Rome, 1942, and the related volume What Italy Gave to the World, and finally the mathematical conference organized by Severi at the National Institute for Advanced Mathematics in 1942. Again, as you can see, most of these initiatives date from the so-called imperial phase of fascism, that is the period between the conquest of Italian East Africa, 1936, and the fall of the regime. And all these initiatives, all these events played a significant role in the process of patrimonialization of Italian mathematical knowledge. Suffice it to say that the celebration of the great masters, Peano, Segre, but also Ruffini, and so on, and their various priorities or records led to the publication of the book series Opere dei Matematici Italiani, edited by the Italian Mathematical Union. All mathematical events provided with a mythopoetic function and value aim to answer some key questions. First, do a Latin spirit or an Italic genius exist in mathematics? Second, assuming they exist, what characteristics do they possess? Third, who are the heroes, the champions, the authentic beings of Italian genius in mathematics? 4. What priorities or records or leading results, primati in Italian, have Italians achieved in mathematics? Primati is a word which cannot be properly translated into English. It basically means we were the first, we were the best, so to say. And last but not least, what leverages should be mobilized to propagandize to foreigners the leading positions achieved in mathematics? We are therefore dealing with a form of political mythopoesis par excellence, founding myths constructed in order to promote and claim to foreigners that Italian mathematics is provided with a glorious past, a lively present, and a glorious future. In short, we are in the sphere of an historic category that I would call scientific nationalism. That is the mechanism of construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of national mathematical identities. A scientific nationalism all the more necessary from 1939 onward, when Italy aimed at justifying its political and cultural dominance of post-war Europe alongside the Axis countries. In short, as Severi clearly stated on many occasions, the heirs of Imperial Rome might be mediocre in military and economic terms, but not in culture. While classical myths have a purpose, generally they explain phenomena, the mathematical storytellings we are dealing with aimed at constructed icons and traditions in the mathematical field, at shaping the collective imagination around Italian mathematics, appealing not only to the mind but also to the instincts of individuals, acting on spectacularization, fascination, the culture of wonder, and so on. For it to be consistent, the mythopoetic construction had to solicit the emotions of its audience, the national spirit and mood, acutely using rhetoric and visual media, iconography, museum-like devices, and social events that can suitably crystallize the narratives and consolidate the myths. And finally, they aim at mitigating eventual fragilities of the Italian mathematical scene. Thus, to claim its own cultural superiority and Italy's right to sit on an equal footing with other great powers, narratives could and should be opportunely falsified. In other terms, there were no fragilities or crises in these mathematical myths, crises that are instead typical of classical Greek myths. Now, it is impossible to give you even an overview of each of the 8 events I've mentioned before, which is why I have chosen to focus on a single case study, in some sense particularly relevant to a program in modern history of contemporary mathematics, such as the one we are participating is, because it is a conference devoted to modern mathematics and its applications. Scheduled for October 1939, the conference Matematica Contemporanea e sue applicazioni was a non-event because it was postponed sine die due to the outbreak of the war and finally cancelled, although the proceedings were published in the summer of 1943. This non-event returns a very intriguing image of Italian mathematical myth-making in mathematics in the last phase of the fascist regime. Accordingly, in the remaining part of this talk, I will adopt it as a lens to examine and describe the mythopoesis concerning Italian supremacy in modern mathematics, with special reference to algebraic geometry, the roles of 2 rhapsods, that is, Severi and Bompiani, and the roles of 2 courts of mathematical mythopoesis, namely the Academy of Italy and the Italian Mathematical Union. And I will use it also to describe the consequences of racial persecution that forced Severi and Bompiani to completely rewrite the history of contemporary Italian geometry, changing the characteristics of the so-called Latin spirit in mathematics and largely mystifying their own professional and scholarly trajectories. But before we do this, let me give you some basic background information. The court. Created by royal decree in 1926 as a reaction to the publication of the Manifesto of the Anti-Fascist Intellectuals, but inaugurated in October 1929, the Reale Accademia d'Italia was established, I quote, as a unifying seal imprinted by the government in the field of high culture, not to enslave but to unite energies and discipline them, reconciling authority and intellectual freedom. It was an advisory body for the regime on cultural matters, a center for the coordination of the country's intellectual forces, and a propaganda authority, which was entrusted with the task of, I quote again, conserving the purity of the national character of research according to the genius and traditions of Italian noble race and enhancing the huge wealth of treasures produced by Italian genius, so that it should no longer happen that Italian discoveries be awarded their first recognition and applications beyond the borders. Chaired by well-known militant fascists such as Marconi, D'Annunzio, and Gentile, the Academy counted 60 members divided into 4 classes. The appointment was for life and entailed honorary privileges and considerable material advantages. On a par with the great dignitaries of the state, authorized to bear the title of Eccellenza, the academicians enjoyed an appealing prerogative, 36,000 lire, that was the equivalent of the annual stipend of a full professor at the end of his career. And for this reason, As well as for the prestige of the title, the position was tempting to many and caused significant fractures in the various scientific and scholarly communities. In fact, the 3 years that passed from the creation to inauguration were due to the endless maneuver which surrounded the appointment of the first academics, to the refusal of some to join the academy, and conversely, to the pressuring by others to enter at all costs. Let me just mention battles that were fought concerning the names of Severi, Federico Enriquez, Gino Fano, Guido Fubini, Tullio Levi-Civita, Giuseppe Peano, and many others. The Academy received from the government an annual gigantic endowment of 4 million lire. But the Duce hoped that the government's munificence would be as poor to private liberality in favor of the highest institute of Italian culture. And as the secretary of the Academy wrote, his hopes were not disappointed. The patriotism of Italians is never appealed to in vain. In June 1930, the Società Generale Italiana Edison di Elettricità donated 10 million lire to Mussolini to establish a foundation named after Alessandro Volta. Il Duce entrusted the administration and the management of the newly born institution to the Academy of Italy, that charged the foundation with a program of foreign cultural policy. The Volta Foundation thus became the task force of the Academy of Italy for International Relations. It integrated the Academy in its highly understood work of Italianness and supported it in its policy of spreading Italian culture abroad through an activity of cultural diplomacy by financing in 9 years 61 travel fellowships abroad and for early career scholars, including the mathematician Luigi Fantapie, and 9 international conferences. Entrusted in odd years to the science class and in even years to the other 3 classes, the Volta conferences were events of high scientific standard. The first meeting, organized by Enrico Fermi, was devoted to nuclear physics and brought 8 Nobel laureates to Rome. But they also had a special political hallmark. And since they were associated with lavish visits, exhibitions, and receptions, they had served also a propaganda function. Nuclear physics, the theater, Africa, and so on were all themes chosen specifically to highlight the strong-willed and realistic ideals that must inspire the new fascist spirit and mood, and to illustrate to the most distinguished men of study in the world the achievements of the government, the leadership positions historically acquired, along with those of more recent conquest. Participation in the Volta conferences was strictly by invitation. For each event, the Academy chose a president who proposed the theme and selected 60 participants divided into speakers and guests. Participation was in a personal capacity, and the invitations were issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Italian diplomatic institutions after political checks were carried out. The names of both the invited lecturers and the guests were then submitted to Mussolini for final approval. For the Volta Conference of 1939, the political investigations were supplemented by checks on racial identity. The true protagonist of our story, our first rhapsode, is Severi. There was no scientific or cultural aspect of mathematics addressed by the Academy of Italy in which he did not intervene. The mathematical candidates were all piloted by him. It was his idea to start a series of books published by the Academy illustrating the Italian contribution to mathematics, and the idea to make the Academy's journals an icon of Italianness, admitting works by foreign mathematicians only in exceptional cases and prohibiting the use of any language other than Italian. In order, I quote, to bring the light of his knowledge and make distinguish the work of Italians with a truly fascist spirit and alacrity, Severi also traveled all over the world with mathematical missions like that in Japan, 1936, to which the Italian press dedicated a media coverage never again replicated. Among his various assignments, Severi was also an advisor of the Volta Foundation, and in 1937 joined its board. It was in this period that the Academy commissioned him to organize the 9th conference. On the agenda for the spring meeting of the board, of the Volta board, there was the attribution to the class of Physical, Mathematical and Natural Sciences of the 1939 conference. Excluding physics, which had already had his congress in 1931, the choice could fall on natural sciences or mathematics, which, however, appeared to the elite of the fascist rule too neutral and unfitting for a propaganda occasion. We have to keep in mind that since the war in Ethiopia, the Academy had gradually escaped the control of the Ministry of Education to fall under the umbrella of the Ministry of Cultural Propaganda, whose directives were very clear. The themes of the Academy's activities had to be established taking into account the needs of Italian cultural progress, leaning towards studies aimed at furthering in their practical applications the economic development of Italy and the enhancement of national resources. Mathematics, so, did not seem to have great prospects of success, and instead Severi forestalled the competition by presenting himself almost 2 years in advance with a title, Matematica Contemporanea e sue applicazioni, and an abstract. No other topic is stated on this occasion could more perfectly highlight one of the sectors in which the creative activity of Italians has been most fruitful, in which Italy held an undisputed primacy and better testified the importance that the regime attributes to the highest scientific speculation, also in consideration of the benefits that pure science always ends up bringing to applications and therefore to social wealth and to the resolution of autarkic problems. There's no doubt that Severi was very convincing because the Volta Foundation entrusted him with organizing the conference and charged him with the presidency of the event. Cashing in on the success, he had to build the team. He did so by involving one single colleague, Enrico Bompiani, a differential geometer and the vice president of the Italian Mathematical Union, whom he admired for his cunning intelligence in moving in political and ministerial circles. Severi's self-feeling of being the man alone at the command of Italian mathematics prevented him from trusting any applied mathematician, so much so that, a case more unique than rare, the organizing committee of the conference consisted of just 2 people, Severi and Bompiani, plus an administration employee of the Volta Foundation. All aspects of the event, from the agenda to selection of the speakers, were managed by Severi and Bompiani, who meant to take advantage of the conference to display their personal mythopoesis of mathematics and to exhibit the Führende Stellung, the leading position of Italian mathematics vis-à-vis Anglophone countries in particular. So, how precisely did things go? First of all, we have to keep in mind that for both Severi and Bompiani, Italic genius had always had certain characteristics. It was applied, aesthetic-based, and synthetic. Had always wanted particular Italian primacies in algebraic geometry, calculus of variations, functional analysis and absolute differential calculus, and some heroes, Castelnuovo, Enriquez, Volterra, Levi-Civita, Pinkerton, and some others. None of these aspects applied anymore in the spring of 1938, when everything suggested that the introduction of anti-Jewish measures in Italy was imminent. The priority was now to give the impression, especially to foreign countries, that Italy maintained all its historical achieved leadership positions, when it was even consolidating new ones, and that it would have not suffered minimally from the exclusion of Jews. The invitations should thus be calibrated appropriately. On the front of applied mathematics, the possibilities were very limited. Levi-Civita and Volterra were Jews. The two most outstanding Aryan applied mathematicians, Francesco Tricomi and Gustavo Colonnetti, were openly anti-fascist. Mauro Piccone was Severi's nemesis, and as a consequence, the only chance was to reduce at the maximum applications, and that is precisely what Severi and Bompiani would do first. Secondly, they had to invite foreign mathematicians who were favorable, so to say, to the Italian style and willing both to recognize the primacy of Italy and to erase Jewish mathematicians from their narratives. That it was no small matter. For example, Severi was well aware that it was not trivial to identify well-disposed algebraic geometers, people who could properly valorize the Italian approach in this field without ever mentioning its recent crisis due to the refusal by Severi and his protégé to use topological and algebraic tools in their arguments. The operation was even more complicated as it involved rewriting the 2/3 of the history of the discipline, cancelling Castelnuovo, Enriquez, along with Corrado Segre, Severi's mentor, Gino Fano, and many others. Finally, it was necessary to impress the foreigners, flanking the talks with a tight social program for participants and their wives, with visits to monuments of the imperial and fascist Rome, sumptuous receptions, archaeological walks, and so on. A pharaonic hospitality entirely financed by the Volta Foundation. Unfortunately, Severi was not able to organize a cruise. He would like to do it, but he did not succeed. Well, it can honestly be said that despite facing these obstacles, Severi and Bompiani met all the expectations of the Academy and succeeded in the organization of the conference. In early 1938, they defined the theme and drew up a preliminary list of possible lectures. The applications, which had been exalted in the rationale of the conference to smooth the upper echelons of the fascist party by appealing to one of the main leitmotifs of the Latin genius, disappeared. The topics were narrowed down to 3: algebraic geometry and topology, functional analysis, and projective differential geometry. On 25 May 1938, satisfied with the preparatory work, Severi fulfilled his dream: to convince Mussolini to inaugurate his Institute of Higher Mathematics in Rome on the occasion of the opening ceremony of the Volta Conference, so as to gain maximum institutional and international prominence to both events. As far as invitations are concerned, the situation immediately began to get complicated. In the summer of 1938, the enactment of the racial laws was now in the air. The leadership of the Academy was worried and wondered if it was not a mistake to call a completely Aryan mathematics conference. Severi and Bompiani, on the other hand, were quiet. Why? Because playing ahead of the game, they had already excluded all Italian Jewish mathematicians from the list of invited speakers. So, When 2 days after the promulgation of the Italian-Russian laws, the president of the Academy, Luigi Federazzoni, pointed out that they would have to be scrupulously applied, Severi could reassure him. The conference will succeed perfectly, even without the participation of the Jews, showing that Italian mathematics is not a province of Israel. Federazzoni would have his appreciation of Comrade Severi, Camerata Severi, put on record. Actually, Severi was not entirely honest, because the racially based scheming had been carried out only for Italians, not for foreigners or for scholars of mixed race. However, the exclusion of Jewish scholars was particularly delicate in a field such as mathematics, in which the Italian Jewish presence was relevant and internationally recognized. How could one talk about algebraic geometry without Segre, Castelnuovo, Enrico, Fano, about functional analysis without Pinkerle and Volterra, about mathematical physics and the projective differential geometry without Levi Civita? Despite the precautions put in place, protests could not be avoided. The most significant episode of scientific and human solidarity was on the part of the Dutchman Schouten, the only mathematician who explicitly refused to take part in a congress that excluded Levi Civita and Segre. The correspondence preserved in the archives of the Academy of Italy and the Italian Mathematical Union, and the letters between Devlen, Birkhoff, Baker, Hodge, Cartan, and many Italian mathematicians and refugee mathematicians have brought new elements of evaluation of individual reactions. Let us show that those who agreed to intervene, often with pride and satisfaction, were aware of the ostracism of Jewish colleagues, and that the reactions of dissent were in the minority, not only on the part of Italians, but also of foreigners and even of scholars from countries where political anti-Semitism did not exist. Documents prove, however, that while Severi assumed the full moral responsibility, I quote from a letter from Severi to Schouten, the full moral responsibility for the exclusion of Jewish mathematicians, it was Bompiani, Enrico Bompiani, our second rhapsode. It was Enrico Bompiani who pressed for meticulous racial controls and for an inflexible application of the exclusion. And it was Bompiani who carefully carried out a censorship of citations and bibliographies in the texts submitted for publication in the proceedings of the conference. Bompiani's zeal, although appreciated by Severi, caused serious difficulties, so much so that when Severi intervened at the meeting of the Volta Foundation in March 1939, he began to be really worried. He had to remove the American Douglas, Jew and an angry Jew to boot, that it's one of one of the annotations, one of the notes on the left of these large tables. He had to remove the American Douglas, Edward Church, who had been erroneously denounced as Jewish by Bompiani, the Hungarian Kerechiarto, and many others. Other names Severi put forward in their place, like Siegel, Bauer, Ries, Cartan, Bompiani rejected or kept in abeyance. His concerns, Severi's concerns about the progress of the preparatory work were such that he consulted the Council of the Ministers, that is Mussolini, namely, on the desirability of inviting at least some 4.5 Jews to the Congress. An equally delicate issue stemmed from the fact that before being issued, invitations had to be first examined and authorized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the diplomatic institutions which were responsible for preliminary investigations into political reliability. Severi and Bompiani were cut off guard by the reactions of these institutions. In addition to the racial exclusions, others arrived that they did not expect. The Danish Harald Bohr, for example, who, according to the notes validated by Ciano, the son-in-law of Mussolini, Harald Bohr, who, according to the annotations by the ministry, like his brother Niels, has taken an attitude of public hostility to racist principles. The Belgian Théophile de Donder, anti-fascist, socialist militant, and a Freemason. The Dutch van der Verden, no reason was given for this exclusion. The French Montel, great dignitary of Freemasonry, and the Kagan, and the mathematician Kagan, Russian and communist. Naturally, every ministerial refusal involved finding a replacement and therefore implied new racial and political investigations. In addition to these, refusals to attend began to arrive from March onward. Schouten, Picard, Lebesgue, Whittaker, Eddington, De la Valle-Poussin, Godot, Veblen, Morse, and others refused to participate. In March 1939, Severi, furious at the way things were going, asked Federazioni to solicit the Ministry of Foreign Affairs so that he could urgently replace the guests who refused to attend. Federazioni invited him not to dramatize and rather to organize a trip to promote and facilitate the coming of foreigners to persuade the doubtful, in a word, to seduce them. Cartan's Jubilee appeared to be an opportunity to be exploited for this purpose. And as a matter of fact, Severi participated to meet Picard, Lebesgue, Denjoy, Fréchet, and to convince them to accept the invitation. But there were very embarrassing moments because some dismissed Italian scholars, like Enriquez and Voltaire's son Edoardo, attended this event too. And in the same period, Severi wrote to many foreign and Italian colleagues, reaching the height of his bad test by asking his former pupil, Beniamino Sega, a refugee in the UK, to convince Baker and Oggio to attend the conference. Regarding invitations to Italians, the situation was no rosier. Already in early 1939, with a resounding about-face, applied mathematicians Piccone, Signorini, and the physicist Gilberto Bernardini had disappeared from the list of invited lecturers had been demoted to simple guests. Status, that is quite an important move. Poet Filippo Marinetti, another member of the board of the Volta Foundation, then asked for explanations and suggested Severi visibly increase the contingent of Italian speakers in order to give a preponderance to the Italian School of Mathematics. Severi replied curtly, 6 Italians, 6 over 60, are well enough, and though through the discussions they will have every occasion for prevailing over the foreign colleagues. In June 1939, a further diplomatic crisis broke out. The Academy of Italy, in fact, absorbed the Lincei. This naturally led to new tensions, for example, with the president of the Italian Mathematical Union, Berzolari, and the dean of the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, Tonelli, who confirmed their participation to the Volta Conference only after having received formal assurance that they had been reappointed as fellows of the Academy of Italy. Moreover, on the Italian side of the story, it's impossible not to mention the reactions of the excluded Jewish scholars, and in particular the sense of marginalization felt by Levi Civita, Volterra, Castelnuovo, Enriquez. They were all perfectly aware that their golden boys, Severi and Bompiani, were organizing the meeting. Borel and Cartan had naively written to them that they expected to meet them on this occasion. Well, Voltaire kept silent. With a touching letter, Levi Civita thanked Veblen for refusing to attend the conference, But there were Castelnuovo and Enriquez who suffered the most bitter humiliation, seeing their best pupils, Bompiani and Severi respectively, who prevented them from attending the geometry section of a conference to be held in their city. Among the refusals, perhaps the most suffered came from Americans. Webben and Morse, informed by Scouten of his decision, turned down the invitation. Birkhoff was the only one to accept at first. Severi and Bompiani's disappointment was severe. American mathematicians, they write, are ungrateful. Severi asserted they are ungrateful who, after having watered, it's a very insulting term in Italian, it's abbeverarsi, it's used for animals, not for individuals. They are ungrateful who, after having watered from the source of the Italian masters, have turned their backs on them. Bompiani suspected that some refugees in Princeton, such as Fubini, flamed hostility against Fascist Italy. So when Birkhoff also withdrew his participation, the situation escalated. After trying in vain to convince Birkhoff to rethink his decision, Severi asked the Italian Mathematical Union for help. Until then, the Union had had nothing to do with the organization of the Volta Conference, and in general had intervened peripheral relationships with the Academy of Italy. The Birkhoff case was the first moment of alliance between the two bodies. The Italian Mathematical Union, namely Bompiani, was at its turn furious in that period because the totally philo-Judaic organizers of the International Congress of Mathematicians, scheduled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, had invited only 2 Italians as plenary speakers, namely Tonelli, for a lecture on the calculus of variations, and Cantelli, who was a specialist in probability theory. Severi fully agreed and added that Americans had completely excluded the Italian algebraic geometers because they counted on elegantly gulling Italy, another very insulting term, that is, they counted on elegantly cheating Italy by inviting Jewish mathematicians still residing in Italy, like Civita, or refugees such as Fubini. Hence, the retaliation plan, coined by Severi and Bompiani to punish, I quote, that philo-Jewish democratic burletta, another insulting term, that American academia is. If the Americans did not participate in the Volta Conference, the Italians would not participate in the International Congress of Mathematicians. In other terms, the Academy of Italy and the Italian Mathematical Union jointly threatened the withdrawal of the Italian delegation from the ICM. The plan was brutally effective to the point that Birkhoff immediately relented and, as a gesture of peace, proposed sending a paper to be read at the Volta Conference so as to participate in absentia. Severi accepted, but in the reply, written in agreement with Bompiani, he did not fail in removing a few pebbles from his shoe. He wrote he felt sorry for Birkhoff, who had been prevented from participating in the Volta Conference. It was not true. And reiterated the warning to invite to ICM only scholars who were at present active members of Italian academies and universities, that is, only Aryan mathematicians. The Volta Conference was a demanding exercise in myth-making also from the strictly mathematical point of view. Here, too, for reasons of time, I will dwell only on the first section, Geometria Algebrica and Topologia, Algebraic Geometry and Topology. The objective in Severi and Bompiani's eyes was twofold. First, to convince the foreigners that Italian algebraic geometry was in full health and that the lack of interpenetration of algebra, abstract algebra, topology, and classical algebraic geometry had not harmed this branch in the least. And secondly, they intended to take advantage without getting caught, of the presence of foreign topologists and algebraists to obtain at least a rough idea of these new trends. Hence, the invitations, for example, to van der Waerden, Chevalet, Veblen, and so on. Due to refusal and replacements, the final squad of lecturers was completely different from that Severi had drafted. Apart from the case of Hasse, all the others were second choices, so to say. But putting on a good face, Severi charged Hasse, Baker, Hodge, and Wirtinger with a specific task: to facilitate the Italian School of Algebraic Geometry in assessing fields, like, for example, arithmetic geometry, in the case of Hasse, that he considered especially promising, but which had been neglected by Italian geometers, not because of a lack of will, but because they were engaged on other fronts. Good intentions, however, went astray when authors expressed, albeit politely, negative evaluations of the contributions of Italian genius. There, Severi completely lost objectivity. This is demonstrated by his interactions with English authors. Baker's text was exalted by Severi as the, I quote from the letter that you can see on the right, the sincere homage that a great master rendered to his former Italian mentors, and as the iconic portrait of the grafting of British algebraic geometry onto the lush and glorious trunk of Italian algebraic geometry. By contrast, Hodge had the unfortunate idea of quoting more Lefschetz than Severi and Italian algebraic geometers in his paper, and was immediately and curtly rebuked. Severi wrote, "I would also ask you to add a brief preface which records the progress made in the algebraic geometry of Italian mathematicians, especially in the last 40 years. Lefschetz himself must be considered as our disciple. Many of the advances in topology made by Lefschetz are a direct or indirect consequence of my research." Hodge, incredibly, hastened to clarify, "I'm sorry that I appeared discourteous to Italian geometry, but I assumed that the dependence of my work on the brilliant researches made in Italy was so obvious that no mention it would have been superfluous." As a matter of fact, Hodge would agree and add to his text 3 pages of eulogy of the Italian of the Italian School of Algebraic Geometry. But the paper, focused on harmonic integrals, remained unchanged. That is, the addition was purely rhetoric, had no mathematical meaning. And the most incredible thing is that Severi was perfectly aware of this, but nevertheless he was fully satisfied because it was not a matter of making mathematics, but of making a mythopoesis of mathematics, a mythopoetical activity. And so, I went to the conclusions. The 1939 Volta Conference was one of the most successful exercises in mathematical mythopoesis, and one of the most successful exercises of science anti-diplomacy during the fascist regime. And its history vividly portrays a dense plot of academic opportunisms, rivalries, authentic or simulated adhesions to fascist and racist ideology, ethical and scientific ideas betrayed by conviction or calculus, a dense plot which characterized Italian mathematics in the imperial phase of the regime. It is an episode historically highly intriguing in itself, whose narrative provides a coherent and expressive micro-model of individual behaviors, still largely to be investigated, and of historical macro-phenomena, such as the consequences of racial persecution and the decline of Italian mathematics between the two wars. But far from being specific to this case study, the rhetoric features and idiomatic categories that characterized this experiment in mathematical mythopoesis can be legitimately mobilized to set up an analysis of the monumentalization, popularization, spectacularization, myth-making of national mathematical traditions and identities in other totalitarian regimes. And I think especially to Franco-Spain, but maybe also to the case of Romania, Portugal, and so on. And in this sense, I think that this episode, although temporarily and continuistically and circumscribed, fits with Adrian's request. The history of mathematics in fascist Italy is a field of historical investigation that has been uncovered by the works of Angelo Guarraggio, Pietro Anastasi, and Giorgio Israel since the 80s. However, thanks to the declassification of many archives in recent years, for example, the archives of the Italian Mathematical Union and the archive of the Academy of Italy, it is now possible to advance in historical research in this field, and it is possible to construct more convincing and nuanced narratives around new contexts, like the Academy of Italy, around new actors, or actors like Severi and Bompiani, who had never been dealt with according to this perspective. It's a matter, so to say, of placing side by side contents and persons, episodes and non-events like the Volta Conference, presences and absences, established facts and gray zones, actions and motivations, explicit and not said, exhibit and concealed. And I strongly believe that this approach fully restores a polyphonic, entangled, composite portrait of the Italian mathematics during the fascist rule. Thank you so much for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Erika, for this wonderful talk. I'm sure there are questions. Nicola.
Thank you, Erika, for this very talk. So even before the episode described, there had been the construction of this image of Italian algebraic geometry that is often characterized as being intuitive. And then there are many actors of that time, but even today, who said, oh, the Italian geometers were intuitive, and then other people found mistakes and brought rigor, especially people from Germany and so on. And so I was wondering how those categories of rigor and intuition were modified and altered throughout those crucial years.
Yes, you are completely right. During the Bologna conference, for example, a plenary lecture was held by Guido Castelnuovo. It was significantly entitled La geometria algebrica, la scuola italiana, that is, algebraic geometry and the Italian school. And it was also an exercise in mythopoesis of geometry. I think that the most important, the algebraic geometry is always characterized in all these exercises of myth-making as intuitive and synthetic. It is characterized by a synthetic style, an intuitive style. Why? Because the aim is to arrive at constructions which are elegant. Castelnuovo explicitly said this. Algebraic geometry must be synthetic and intuitive because intuition fully render this aesthetic of the theory of surfaces, the research of hidden harmonies of the theory of algebraic surfaces, varieties, and so on. Topology, no. topology is something non-aesthetic at all, is inelegant, so to say. It's heavy, and that's the same thing for abstract algebra. So this is a leitmotif of Italian algebraic, of Italian genius in algebraic geometry, which remains unchanged. That is from 1928 to the end, 1942, the last moment in the history of mathematical mythopoesis. This character remains. The character of to be intuitive, aesthetic-based, and so on, remained unchanged, but the history is completely rewritten from the point of view of actors, because the vast majority of algebraic geometries were Jews.
Okay, we have 4 minutes and 3 questions. Reinhard is first.
Yeah, you showed clearly how pure mathematics was being used by the Severi and Pompiani for propaganda purposes. And at the same time that applied was reduced within the institute. Of course, there was another institute which you mentioned by Piccone, under Piccone, and now
it was exactly the opposite.
Who were not good friends, right? Although they were both good fascists. What kind of position or function did the Piccone Institute play also?
It was really the opposite. That is, in all the mythopoetic activities of Piccone, for example, Piccone's mathematical journey in Poland, 1939, but also in all the ceremonies, for example, the Universal Exhibition in Rome, 1942, Piccone strongly defended this leading theme of applications. Applications were useful also for war research, and Piccone was Severi's nemesis. That is, when Severi succeeded in creating his Istituto, l'Istituto Nazionale di Alta Matematica, INDAM, that is exactly at the same period of the Volta Conference, he had, for the first time, the opportunity to had the better with respect to Piccone. And he marginalized completely Piccone and all the other applied mathematicians, both from the Academy of Italy. Piccone never succeeded to enter the Academy of Italy, and to the Volta conferences and to all the initiatives that he led.
David?
I asked my question at the break.
Michael? He will ask his question at the break. Michael?
Okay, well, I'll try to make it quick. So I think it's useful for us all here to recognize the extent to which many of us are writing national histories of mathematics in contexts of fascist governments. And so I wondered if you could, in a way that maybe applies more to our present circumstances than many of the talks that we've seen this week, reflect on what lessons there are from this history for our current acts of mythopoesis as historians of mathematics in times of renewing fascism.
We see fascism coming up. So
yeah.
What can we do?
In many places already arrived. So
well, I'm trying to be
mild.
That's
really a good question. If it is cannot put on record, my answer is that one. I was really shocked to read in a letter from Severi to Pompiani exactly the same slogan: "Make Italy great again." It was exactly the same words that are also nowadays used. And I have to say, as an Italian, that some leading themes, "Open to Meraviglia" is the title of the campaign, the press campaign by the Ministry of Tourism last year, "Open to Meraviglia," and things like that exactly goes in this way, in this address. It's a matter of fact that history returns with striking analogies. Also in the rhetoric, in the rhetoric way of dealing with the cultural themes.
So this may be called the social responsibility of the historian of mathematics. And I think it would be a very important theme of research and reflection. 0.